Very quickly before I start this review, a huge shout out to the local weeb who volunteered to be the editor for this video while my repetitive strain injury for my hands and forearms are still healing. If you want to follow him, I've linked his Twitter and his YouTube in the description below. Amatsutsumi is a visual novel developed by Purplesoft and released in English by Sekai Project. If the art style or Purplesoft as a visual novel developer sounds familiar, it's because they've released a few visual novels in English already. There's Happy Mare, released by Manga Gamer, and Chrono Clock, released by Sekai Project. That said, I personally have not read either of those, so my review is going to be based on a first experience with Purplesoft in Amatsutsumi. So what made me interested in reading Amatsutsumi? Well, its premise is quite interesting. It stars the main character Makoto, who has this power called the Kotodama, which allows one to control people with the power of one's voice. Basically, you can use commands to make people do what you want. However, the limitation is limited to what a person could feasibly do. So for example, you can't make someone just fly, but you can make them realistically do certain simple actions like moving away or standing still. You can make them forget a conversation happened. You can make them say a certain thing, etc. This premise alone sold me to want to start reading this visual novel. Going more into our protagonist, Makoto, the story starts out with him showing how he lives in a relatively isolated village where he and everyone else in that village has the power of Kotodama. However, due to some certain circumstances, he decides for himself that he wants to leave the village and try to learn more about the outside world and get along with more, I guess you can call, normal people. However, he starts off in a rough spot when he's traveling and he ends up passed out on the side of the road in a small town. Thankfully, as he's about to die, he is found by Kokoro, one of the main heroines, and takes him in. This starts the story of Amatsutsumi. The beginning of the story kind of shows how Makoto can use the Kotodama on random people and kind of showing how this supernatural power of his can be used to manipulate people into rather simple things. That said, later on in the story, you'll get to see more complex versions of the Kotodama, but the beginning of his uses of Kotodama is quite interesting because I'm not used to seeing a protagonist that's just willing to use this power to kind of just make people do whatever. Thankfully, at best, or I guess in this case at worst, Makoto will use this power in relatively benign ways, mainly to get himself to be a transfer student at a high school, due to that being one of the many things he wants to try now that he's interested in the outside world and exploring. Also, remember how I stated he was picked up by Kokoro? Well, since he's now without a house or a home, since he's in this random new town, he actually uses the Kotodama to rewrite Kokoro and her mom Azuki's memories so that in their minds, he's Kokoro's long-lost brother and Azuki's long-lost son. Thankfully, Makoto doesn't just use this opportunity to be a scumbag and just freeload. In fact, I'd say he actually starts off as a pretty decent person. Since the place he's living at doubles as a cafe, he actually takes the time to actually learn how to be a proper employee, like helping Azuki with cooking and tending to the cafe. So if you're worried about this Makoto guy being kind of a dickhead or anything, thankfully he's not that. Since he grew up in a remote village, his morals are definitely quite a bit different from most people. Thankfully, one of the main things I like about Amatsutsumi is that Makoto does eventually realize what quote-unquote regular human morals are, and he kind of realizes one would be more beneficial or less intrusive ways to use Kotodama, or at least ways that would make him feel less guilty. So based on the premise and what I've showed, you might be thinking that this is some kind of slice of life story with a random supernatural power. While there is a fair share of slice of life, I would actually say the genre is more like a karaage or a character development heavy visual novel, and at times a nakige, one that's intended to make you cry, something similar to like a key visual novel. This brings me to my next point. This visual novel has the relatively uncommon route structure called the ladder structure. If you read the visual novel Jisenjo no Mao, you'll find that Amatsutsumi is exactly like that. But in case you don't know, the ladder structure is quite different from most visual novels with, say, a common route in a few ways. So I guess right off the bat, this visual novel has a true route and a true heroine. In many visual novels, when you have a true route and true heroine, it's just like most other visual novels. You have a common route where you eventually meet all the heroines and then decide which route to go through once the common route is done. And the true route and heroine could be one of those. However, the way Amatsutsumi works is that the story is actually divided up into chapters. There are 4 main heroines, and conversely, there are 4 chapters in this visual novel. The first chapter will focus mostly on one heroine and her character development. You know how in most heroine routes, usually the first third to a half is based on the heroine's character development, and then maybe they move into the romance afterwards, or maybe they mix the two? Well, in Amatsutsumi, since each chapter focuses on one heroine each, it's definitely possible to have all the heroines' main character development pre-romance in the main story, assuming you go on the common route. Once the climax of the heroine's main character development starts, you're given a choice, and this will determine if you want to romance the heroine in question. And if you do that, you're going to be locked out of the true route, and basically the story will end by going into having the main character Makoto romancing the heroine of that chapter in particular. If you do that, the story basically just branches off, and the rest of the story is just a separate branch where it's focused a little bit more on romantic progression, and of course, since this is a 18+ visual novel, H scenes. Once you finish that romance section, then the game will end, and you'll get that heroine's ending. If you want to continue to the main story and see the next heroine's character development, all you have to do is go back to the previous choice and just click basically the friend zone option. And once you do that, what I'll call the common route version of the heroine's chapter will continue to start. For the first 3 chapters, it's perfectly possible for you to not romance the first 3 heroines at all, but still get their main character development. And this would technically be the common route. This ladder structure is something I personally really like, but at the same time, it definitely has to be executed pretty well. I have seen some people not too into the ladder structure because you're basically forced to kind of go through half a heroine's character route, and if you don't care for the heroine, then it's just going to be a drag because you're kind of forced to see their development when you're just going through the main story. Thankfully, I would say in the case of Amatsutsumi, all 4 chapters are quite interesting and well done, so I didn't think it was an issue, and in fact, that was one of the best things I loved about this visual novel, since I thought all 4 main heroines were quite interesting. Speaking of the 4 main heroines, now I want to go into each of them, going in the order that their chapters show up. The first heroine is Kokoro Overview. As stated earlier, she is the one who picks up Makoto after he collapses in the middle of that field and takes her into her and her mom's cafe. Kokoro's personality is definitely a little bit on the simple side. She's the least complex character of the 4, but I would say she's definitely one of the more likable ones. It'd be safe to call her a dere character, or basically just an energetic, friendly, kind of spontaneous character. She's definitely openly affectionate with the people she likes, but more especially so with her family and close friends. The theme of her chapter is definitely related to family. While I did say her personality is a little bit on the simpler side, she's definitely not without depth, and I think her chapter showcases that well. If you notice, I talked about Kokoro and her mom, but she doesn't have a dad or any other siblings. Well, not naturally at least. What I really liked about Kokoro's chapter is that it definitely focuses a lot on her connection with her family in particular, especially with her mom. To not spoil her out too much, Basically, there's a reason that her and her mom's cafe are a little bit inconsistent, and I really liked the progression of her character development related to her and her mom. The climax in particular was quite emotional, and to me, it really helped set the stage of what the rest of Amatsutsumi's storytelling was going to be like. So once you start the romance part of Kokoro's chapter, it mostly relates to the whole thing with Makoto basically rewriting Kokoro's mind so that he's her big brother. What Makoto finds out kind of quickly is Kokoro kind of has a thing for indecent relationships. Basically, the idea of romancing her big brother actually excites her a lot more than he expected. And I won't say any more, but basically the romance part of her route deals with that, and I guess it's kind of amusing, but might be kind of weird for any readers who are kind of weirded out how they're not actually blood related, but Kokoro was basically tricked to think they're blood related. But thankfully, I would say their relationship and interactions are good to where everything turns out alright, at least in my eyes. The second heroine and the second chapter of Amatsutsumi focuses on Kyouko Asahina. When Makoto transfers into his new high school, Kyouko is in his grade, which is a second year. She does have a kind of typical extremely shy, low self-esteem kind of personality. However, Kyouko has some really interesting insecurities, but one of them basically relates to how she does want to make friends, but basically due to unintentional bad impressions with her other students, she's unable to make friends easily, so she's extremely shy and the rest of the class has kind of trouble talking to her. Thankfully, Makoto is able to become surprisingly fast friends with Kyouko, and you can tell she's very, very grateful for him befriending her, to the point where she almost kind of praises him like a god in a sense. A few other interesting things about her that are revealed kind of early on are that she's a shrine maiden at the town shrine, but more importantly, she has this rather weird sixth sense where she can see ghosts, or I believe the story calls them spirits, and that is one of the main things that leads to her chapter. I would say the main theme of her chapter is friendship. As I said earlier, she's very shy and wants nothing more than to make friends with other people, but due to circumstances she can't. But Makoto realizes early that she does have the potential to make friends, and part of it is him helping her out to do the right thing. But there's definitely a lot more to her route that's quite emotional, and I can't reveal it, but I'll just say I would argue the climax of her route is arguably more emotional than Kokoro's, which is saying a lot because the climax of Kokoro's common route chapter definitely got me quite emotional, but Kyoko's was quite good too. Once you get into the romance part of Kyoko's chapter, it deals a little bit more with Kyoko's sixth sense of seeing ghosts or spirits. I thought this was a pretty decent part of her chapter, but probably my least favorite of the romance portions of the heroine's chapters, but still not bad, maybe a little cheesy. The third heroine, or third chapter, is Mana Koizuka. She is actually Makoto's childhood friend, and in fact is his fiancée officially. Since she grew up in the same village as him, she also has kotodama, and is in fact quite a bit better at kotodama than him, being able to basically overpower him if they were to have like a kotodama battle, and she definitely has the strong personality to suit that need. Basically, the reason she gets into the story is because, you know how I said Makoto escaped from the village to try to get a new life with real humans? Well, Mana was one of the people who was looking for Makoto after he escaped, and she just happened to be the one to find him. However, once she found out that he really wanted to try to make his best as a regular human in a human world, she decided to kind of cut him some slack and let him kind of explore things a little bit more, but with the goal of eventually kind of forcing him back into the village when necessary. Getting into Mana's personality though, I basically like to call her a femdom dere childhood friend. So when I think of that term, it's kind of like Momoyo from Majikoi or Kagome from Kamyu. Basically, she's definitely one of those people that kind of has to have things her way. She has this almost kind of sadistic way of making Makoto squirm or do things that she wants and getting a reaction out of him. Yet at the same time, it's pretty obvious that she does clearly love him. And while she does show obvious love and concern for him, unfortunately for anything else that's not in her interests, she can definitely be more of an ice queen, basically giving that cold, I don't give a crap about you personality to whoever she doesn't give a crap about, essentially. The theme of Mana's Common Route chapter is related to their childhood, and more specifically, a little bit more on the potential of Kotodama. As I said earlier, Mana is quite a bit more skilled in Kotodama over Makoto, but even she has limitations. So when certain personal things get in the way, it'll be quite interesting to see how Mana and Makoto's relationship changes. Unfortunately, Mana is probably my least favorite of the main heroines, and part of why that is, in addition to her kind of bitchy, strong personality, is how she acts in the middle of her Common Route chapter, which kind of turned me off to her character, which was unfortunate because I was kind of slowly warming up to her at that point. Thankfully, the climax of her route was interesting, and once you get to the romance part of her route, I actually thought it was probably the best of the 3 routes that have romance sections. It was just generally pretty wholesome, especially when you consider everything that happened in the Common Route. She was definitely at her best, at least to me in this chapter, which is unfortunate because I'm extremely hit or miss on her otherwise. Finally, the 4th and true final heroine of the story, and final chapter for that matter, is Hotaru Minazuki. She is best friends with Kokoro, and while she does have a kind of similar personality to Kokoro in terms of being a generally energetic kind of person, she's definitely not as simple as Kokoro. She's a lot more blunt, mischievous, kind of trolly, and has many cases of foreshadowing that lets on she's a lot deeper than she appears. That said, whenever she does show on screen in the slice of life portions, she is a pretty fun character. Now, Hotaru is definitely the true route and true heroine for good reason. Many people I've talked to say her route is the main reason for even reading this visual novel, and that you could easily skip the romance branches of the other 3 heroines just to get to her quicker. While I still liked the romance branches of the other 3 heroines enough, by the time I reached the end of Hotaru's route, I could definitely see where the hype came from. Since it's the most story-oriented route, I'm gonna have to be really careful talking about it in terms of spoilers. But basically, all the foreshadowing you get about Hotaru starting from Kokoro's chapter all comes to fruition, and you get to learn a lot more about Hotaru, and the romance that plays between her and Makoto is quite interesting, though I'll admit I wasn't quite sold on their romantic chemistry at first, but by the second half of her route, I was definitely quite hooked. There's just a lot of really interesting reveals, and the ending in particular is poetic. All the character development that Makoto, Hotaru, and other characters were leading up to all come to one big climax and ends up being really, really good. I think many times plot visual novels sometimes miss their mark in their endings, but I thought Amatsutsumi ended itself really greatly. If you decide to read this visual novel, definitely make sure you read to Hotaru's route because it's definitely quite a ride. Now I want to go to a few technical or side aspects of Amatsutsumi. The first thing I want to talk about is the general presentation of Amatsutsumi. I would say the first thing that pops out is the art style that Purplesoft is pretty well known for. This isn't just your typical anime art style. Purplesoft does have anime aesthetics to it, but I feel like their sprite work just has this particular unique style to it that I haven't seen from other more typical anime styles in Moege. It kind of feels like the character sprites are just a bit more detailed than other. It's hard to say, but many people praise Purplesoft's art style, and I can definitely agree it definitely sticks out. One thing that might be kind of weird to people when reading this visual novel is the text box. So, as you might have seen throughout the video, for some reason, Purplesoft has this thing where they like moving the text box around throughout the screen and doesn't just stay at the bottom of the screen like most ADV visual novels. Personally, I still don't get why they do this besides, I guess, just for artistic flair. But by the end, I did get used to it, but at the same time, I just never really got why Purplesoft had to do it like this. The other interesting thing about their presentation and UI is the fact that their UI is actually on the top of the screen with these big buttons. a lot of them are just the typical options you'll see in visual novels like auto read, skip, system, save, load, etc. But I was talking with somebody and I realized that Purplesoft visual novels seem to like to make things touchscreen friendly. So basically, if you like to read visual novels on some kind of tablet, or maybe something like the Steam Deck where you can tap on the screen like a mouse, then Purplesoft is actually one of the better visual novels that I would say are for tablets or Steam Decks or something, since you can easily tap on the screen and tap on the buttons. They're not just like these little tiny buttons like on the bottom of the screen like in most visual novels. So just a fun little cool thing they have in there. With the music, I have pretty much nothing but praise for. The goofy songs work for comedy moments. They have some pretty chill slice of life themes. Each of the main heroines have their own theme songs which fit their character. But most importantly, they have really good emotional songs for the big, hard-hitting, climactic, emotional moments in the story, and they only just help make the emotional moments in this main story that much better. Now I want to get into a maybe slightly controversial part of this visual novel related to the H scenes. I suppose the less controversial aspect is just the fact that there's quite a lot of H scenes, or at least a bit more than the usual for story-oriented visual novels. There are only 4 main heroines, but each of them have 5 to 6 H scenes each. And while they're not like the longest H scenes ever, they're definitely not on the short side. And I would say they're definitely quite a bit above average length for an H scene. So if you decide to skip them, then, it might take you a minute or two to get past some of them. However, I would say definitely the more controversial aspect of the H scenes in this visual novel is the fact that the main character likes to sleep around a lot. So just as like a quick, very minor spoiler, there's a flashback at the way beginning of Amatsutsumi, and it's where he has an H scene with Mana while they're in the village. This is a very interesting way to show that he is not a virgin at the start of the story, which I guess is pretty unique for a story visual novel, especially with a high school age visual novel main character, I guess. However, the real controversy to me is that by the end of Kokoro's common route portion of her chapter, he has had sex with 3 out of the 4 main heroines by that point. And by the end of Kyoko's common route portion of her chapter, he's basically has had sex with all 4 main heroines, all before choosing any of them as a permanent romantic option. I think it's pretty safe to call Makoto a man whore in this case. The only real, I guess you can call, justification of him doing this is most of the heroines basically come on to him. And I guess in Mana's case, since they were fiancés, it'd be expected that they were essentially in a relationship and not weird for them to have sex at that point. That said, if the fact that Makoto basically has sex with all the main heroines in the common route, like even before the romance and relationships start, that could be a potential problem for people who are definitely heavily morally against that. That said, while I'm not personally for having sex outside relationships, I do think, at least in the case of Makoto and the heroines, the fact that they did have sex outside relationships did kind of make sense in the sense of the story and how their characters were. So I wasn't too against it, I guess, but it's definitely not something I'd probably want to see too often in a visual novel. I mean, outside of that, the H scenes are about what you'd expect from a visual novel eroge. They have like the typical kind of goofy dialogue where the heroine likes to explain everything that's happening to them, and then the main protagonist likes to describe in narration like all the little things that he's doing or what's happening, and it's whatever. Just nothing too fetishy, I guess I'll say, about the VNs outside maybe a couple of maybe light fetishy stuff. Now I want to get into more of my personal opinions on this visual novel. So one thing I haven't said yet is I think this visual novel is actually extremely well paced, especially for a story or character development heavy visual novel. While I did say this visual novel does have slice of life, I don't think too much of it, if any of it at all, was boring or wasted dialogue. In fact, I felt like this is one of the few story or character development heavy visual novels that it had just the right amount of slice of life before it kind of got straight into building up into the story climaxes of each chapter. This visual novel is just pretty well-rounded in general, having nice slice of life, but definitely gets right on track to building up the characters' personalities, relationships, and all that stuff. So I give the pacing definitely a big plus. I did say Mana was my least favorite of the main heroines, but honestly, she had plenty of moments to where she's definitely not one of like my least favorite characters ever or anything. I would overall say she's like maybe meh at worst, but thankfully, I actually quite like the other three main heroines. I think all of their stories are great, their personalities are quite likable, and there's some really good and emotional reveals in each of their routes. So at least for me, it was definitely worth reading for those three main heroines alone, but even Mana's character and chapter had moments that made me think it was overall worth reading too. There are other side characters that show up pretty often, and while they're not that many, I'd say they do a pretty good job of giving the main cast some good interactions with characters outside the main core cast, and a bunch of these side characters do end up being quite helpful to making the heroines' stories better. Getting more into my final overall thoughts of this visual novel, I definitely think it was quite good for the vast majority of it. Sure, there were some flaws here and there, mostly related to kind of weird execution of a few H scenes, and Mana not being really likable for a lot of it, and maybe some few other minor flaws. However, I would say the vast majority of my experience with Amatsutsumi was really good. I love the ladder structure, making all the main heroes' character development canon in the true ending. I thought each chapter individually had something really interesting to offer. I thought the vast majority of the characters were quite likable. The comedy was generally pretty good, the pacing was really good, and the way the True Route's final ending was executed was really good, and something that I think is surprisingly not too common to see a good ending in a story-heavy visual novel. I would definitely recommend Amatsutsumi to anyone looking for a good romance and story-heavy visual novel. Overall, I would give Amatsutsumi an 8.5 out of 10, rounded up to a 9. And that concludes my Amatsutsumi review. What did you think of this review? Has it convinced you to read it? Or have you already read this visual novel? And if so, what are your opinions on it? Feel free to leave a comment below.